I've been reading this book about like underground New York and like all municipal systems and water and electricity and stuff like that. And one of my absolutely favorite facts is, which wasn't part of the book, but just something that I happened to learn, was that one of the original municipal water systems in Manhattan was a company called the Manhattan Company that was started by Aaron Burr, one of the first vice presidents of the United States, who shot Alexander Hamilton on the banks of Weehawken, if I'm not mistaken.
I've seen the musical.
Jay.
Well, I was going to say, he also tried to do a coup later in his life. Yeah, after he fell out of favor, obviously after killing Hamilton, he, like, traveled to, like, the Louisiana territory, which was recently bought, and he tried to, like, gather a bunch of people around him. I think he might have involved Mexico somehow in this, or asked them for support or something, and basically tried to stage a military coup of the young United States and set himself up as a military dictator. And of course, it went nowhere because he only had like 6 guys with him. And they, for some reason, they like launched this expedition from the Louisiana territory, which at that time, was basically, it was just inhabited by the Native American populations and stuff. There wasn't really like any American outposts or anything set up yet, or very, very minimal, and a few French things. Yeah, and I think he was like, I can't remember how it ended up, but he did get like court-martialed. Like he was like brought in front of the government, and he was like, had only recently been the vice president, and they're like, what are you doing?
Wow.
Like, what are you doing? Lyndon LaRouche maintains that this was a British plot, which probably was true.
Boy.
It probably was true that this was some kind of weird, behind-the-scenes proto-British intelligence attempt to stifle the nascent rebellious republic. But I think, like, I don't even know if they put him in jail. I think they were just like, come on, dude. Like, you were vice president. Like, what are you doing? And he was like, I know, I fucking suck. And they're like, your legacy is ruined now. And he was like, I fucking suck. And then I think he just died because he was really old at that time. I'm a little murky on the later details of that story.
Right. It does sound right, because I have noticed he is dead.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Still. So anyway, the Manhattan Company was one of the first municipal water companies in Manhattan. What it did was they took these like hollowed out trees, these like hollowed out logs, and cobbled them together to make the municipal water system to distribute water. It was only like part of Manhattan, and people complained that it just tasted like shit, because it's basically like these rotten logs that are just like leaking and everything's passing through it, and everyone was at the time, I believe, drinking shit like cider and low ABV beer to stay hydrated and shit in Lower Manhattan. And that company, as most companies do, metastasized and, changed and M&As, and it eventually became the Chase Manhattan Company. And that was one of the first companies that is the Chase Bank that we know now today.
Oh.
And here's the punchline. The logo, if you can imagine the Chase logo in your mind.
I can't.
Like the kind of like, Google it, man. I don't...
I
can't, man. It's like these little, like, there's like 4 adjoining trapezoids to make kind of like a circle.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. That is the logo is a cross section of one of those original municipal hollowed out logs, one of those original pipes. That's where that logo comes from.
Interesting.
So there you go.
You know about the Croton Aqueduct?
Dude, it's so I'm nerding the fuck out on this shit. Yes.
Yeah.
Talk, please.
Well, in the early 1830s, 1820s, 1830s, there were a bunch of like diseases that had like outbreaks in New York City, including it was like hay fever and yellow fever. I don't know what these diseases are, but they're so antiquated.
Both are the same thing. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's like
one's like an allergy and the other one is like an actual contagion. But yeah,
okay,
same.
All right. Well, there was like an outbreak of this, and it caused a lot of problems in the city. And at that time, New York City was mostly condensed to like sub Canal Street and stuff. It was very much just the southern tip of Manhattan Island, and then with a few settlements and things that stretched on beyond that. It hadn't really grown to the full city that it is today. Anyway, so after these like epidemics came out, people were like, part of the reason was like the contaminated water supply, and so the idea was to build an underground aqueduct that went all the way up to Croton, New York.
Yep.
To you know, it was something like 30 miles to get water from there and to drive it underground into the city, and it worked. It was very successful, and it was in operation until the 1950s, and then they shut it down. And there are still a few like in the city limits, and especially outside, but like most of the kind of like maintenance above ground blocks of these things were ultimately, you know, especially after the 1950s, they were destroyed or removed, you know, built over, whatever. But when I was young, there were two access points that you could still get into. One was in Lower Manhattan, and the other one was in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx.
Yeah. One train.
And the only reason I know about this is I had a friend who was into like urban spelunking, and the first time I dropped acid, I went into the Croton Aqueduct in Van Cortlandt Park. We tried to get into the one in Lower Manhattan, but you had to like go through like a sewer, and it was really dark. And it's above ground. They're like these weird stone structures. They must have been, you know, some kind of ventilation and maintenance thing. And we crawled in there, and I remember thinking like, man, this is like really cool. This is really interesting. But like the whole process of doing it had taken so long that by the time that we were actually in the Croton Aqueduct in Van Cortlandt, and we'd, you know, climb down into this thing, and we were like in the tunnel, like the acid had worn off, and like I was like, I'm just in a sewer. Like I'm in an abandoned sewer. What am I doing? Like, why? And I remember my friend was really enthusiastic about it. He was like, no, let's like keep going. And he like crawled through, like, because there was this like one point where you had to like get on your hands and knees and literally crawl through like dirty water to then get into the main tunnel. And a lot of like urban spelunkers and like graffiti artists and stuff have been in there. There's probably pictures you can find of, you know, cool like pieces that are done in this weird old abandoned tunnel. But it was also like pitch black. And I just had this weird moment of like, no, this sucks actually. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to crawl on my hands and knees through sewage with rats, insects, you know?
It's a problem.
That's probably how you get hay fever, you know? Like
we'll have to check the medical journals on that. It's astounding to me how much life in New York City and any major city in the industrial age was just a fucking cesspool of garbage.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
well, like,
it was just nobody bathed. Nobody bathed.
Like you pointed
Literally.
out, too, before, you know, all of the things that we kind of associate now as part of the background noise of urban life, like sewage control, you know, trash maintenance, like fire departments, like these things were not already there. Like the reason why these exist was these were, you know, like social, you know, quasi-socialistic ideas that were introduced into industrial living to make it bearable, because before that, like, shit was just constantly on fire. There was just shit and dead people like in the streets,
literally,
especially if you were in a poor neighborhood. You know, chemical runoff, all of like the smog that comes from like factories, you know, just horrible working conditions. And unfortunately, in a lot of places in like the global south and in you know, in Asia as well, like where the manufacturing belt of the world is now, a lot of these places are like that. And that's one of the reasons why manufacturing moved over there, because they're like, well, we don't want to have to pay taxes, so you can have a fire department or like working pipes, you know.
Mm-hmm. It was bleak. Like people would just throw trash in the street, and neighborhood pigs and chickens would just kind of eat it. No, seriously, that was their method of disposal.
Yeah.
Sewage, they had like running off literally Canal Street. Yeah. Literally canal. It was a canal of shit that was flowing into the Hudson, of human soil, as they called it. There was just a canal of shit going into the Hudson. And eventually, like, you couldn't like go bathing in like you know, Brighton Beach or something like that. You couldn't go swimming without coming out with fucking dermatitis. Like, so they were like, okay, we're all just swimming and living in everybody else's shit, and so we have to do something. And Shane, to your point, I've been giving this a lot of thought when, you know, now that I've been kind of like studying this stuff, is like sanitation is healthcare. You know what I'm saying? Like, the whole apparatus of those social programs is to make our lives better. And I had this argument with a staunch capitalist the other day. I was like, well, why are you so freaked out by the term socialism when you are the beneficiary of many pieces of socialism today in the United States, like the fire department, like the sanitation department, like water, municipal water and shit. Like, do you want to fucking dig a well? Do you want to like adjust the pH in your own septic tank? The fuck's wrong with you? But yeah, it is those things are apparatuses that give to our healthcare. It is amazing to me that water comes to my tap in New York from like the Catskills. And it's clean and potable and tastes fucking good. New York City water is delicious.
One of the best municipal waters you could have.
Really good stuff.
As a contrast, as far as I know, the Philadelphia water supply is also pretty clean, but for whatever reason, it tastes kind of like pool water because of the cleaning stuff they put in it, and like it's not like directly chlorine, but it's like a few other things that are sort of reminiscent of that same kind of thing, but that are, at least the city says, safe, relatively safe to drink. But interestingly, a lot of people in the city, particularly in more depressed communities and marginal communities in Philadelphia, are like suspect of the water supply because it tastes like that, and so everybody buys like bottled water. And there's been this like weird push to like introduce, like the city has like gone out and done these like water taste test things, which is, I mean, probably like one of the better ways you could manage it. I don't know on a policy level how you try to encourage people to be okay with the water, but they do like the Pepsi challenge with like glasses of water.
That's funny.
And they're like, here, try some water. Like, did you like that? That's from the tap. Like, you can drink that. It's safe. It's okay.
Wow.
I don't actually know if it's safe. I'm kind of just trusting the city of Philadelphia.
Man, it's fine.
So if somebody else out there is like a water management person and knows something, please DM Dwight and complain about it to him. And
please. Yes, I would like to have all municipal civil engineers DMing me. I went to the public library and I went, there was like the different wings you can go to, and one's like literature, and I'm like, fuck that, whatever. I don't know. It doesn't.
Just
I'm sure
this body of intellectual work that stretches to the beginning of civilization. Yeah, fuck that.
Doesn't do much for me.
Who gives a shit?
And I was walking past, and it said like technology and science, and I was like, okay, let's see what we got. And then there was one aisle that was just called like municipal plans, and I was just like, yeah, now we're fucking talking. And in retrospect, I bet I wonder if they track those people like, trying to look this stuff up.
You have maps of the city's infrastructure with like bits of red push pins and yarn and stuff, connecting things with big circles with dates attached to future dates attached to specific locations. Yeah.
It crossed my mind because in the forward of this book, they were talking about how there's this guy that's like just like the real fucking guru of like subterranean New York, and there was I think it was when the United Nations was being built or something like that, and they consulted this guy to be like, what is the risk? Can somebody get into the UN or get something bad to the UN through municipal tunnels and shit, water and sewer? And he basically said like, it would be extremely difficult, and if it's raining, they would be drowned and shunted off into the bay, basically. It's wild to me.
You want to hear another little bit of municipal factoid history related to what I was saying?
This tickles all of my buttons. Please go
Chris
on.
is like rolling his eyes right now.
Yeah. Sorry.
Please go on.
So that hay fever epidemic I was talking about, that happened in like the 1820s and 30s, right? When that happened, when an epidemic happens anywhere, right, what happens, especially on a class basis, right? Rich people move and poor people can't. Poor people are stuck. They don't have the resources to. They have more familial ties and things, and responsibilities in an immediate way. And so what the rich people of Manhattan did, not all of them, but a significant amount, they moved just north of the city. And again, the city at that time was like basically, Soho and lower, right? They moved just north to this little settlement called Greenwich Village. And so in Greenwich Village, right, it was this small, little village that had started growing just north of the city. And like any ad hoc, unplanned, city thing, it had all these weird, narrow lanes and streets and stuff. And a lot of lower Manhattan as well looked like that at the time. But then much later, in the 1880s or 1890s, I forget exactly when, there was a plan to redesign the entire city, at least north of like Houston Street, to redesign the entire city into a grid. Because at that, by that time, by the end of the century, it had grown so exponentially that they, it merited did this like massive kind of redesign, you know, and that's why you have like the numbered streets and the numbered avenues, right? That's where that idea comes from. And so part of this plan, like I said, was originally everything north of Houston Street was just going to be a straight grid all the way to the tip of the island, until two things prevented that. First of all, when they originally presented the maps, like the architect or the firm or whatever had the maps, one of the first reactions was like, this is going to be awful. Like, we needed some kind of like park or something. And so that was then the idea of Central Park in the middle of that giant grid, to build this huge rectangular park, so it wasn't just a wall-to-wall city. You had some kind of recreational space or whatever in there. Because most of the other parks, especially in Lower Manhattan, are actually all paupers' graves.
What?
Because where else, you know, like rich people's cemeteries you couldn't pave over, but like poor people's cemeteries, so like Washington Square Park, Foley Park, you know, all those kind of like large parks were originally like poor people's cemeteries. But anyway, so north of Houston Street, again, they wanted to do everything as a grid, and people who are from New York City, which I'm sure is like, you know, a very small percentage of our audience, and everybody else doesn't give a shit about this, but like people who are from New York City will know that, you know, the grid really only starts, especially on the west side, when you hit like 14th Street, because you have beneath that like Greenwich Village,
right?
And the reason why it still is like that, with all these weird lanes that aren't numbered streets and have names like Cherry Lane or like fucking, you know,
Northmore,
right?
Thompson.
Exactly, like all these named weird streets and winding lanes that don't really conform to a pattern, is because the rich people now had been living there for a generation or two, and they liked the quaintness of their houses and stuff, and because they were rich, they had sway to pull with the city designers to be like, no, you can't redesign our area, you're gonna have to design around it. And so that's why Greenwich Village today is still the way it is.
What the fuck?
Yeah.
That is wild.
So it's interesting. I mean, obviously this is like factoid history, and you're saying like, why am I bringing this up? But here comes the twist that I love. Like, the point here is that this is also evidence of generational wealth and how it works, right? Like, it's inscribed into your surroundings. It's not just this abstract thing. Like, it literally affects the pace and the structure of development. And so much of it is there that, like, you know, for then a long time afterwards, especially when you hit the 20th century, Greenwich Village kind of went into, I don't know, disrepair, or like became more like a bohemian vagabond area. It wasn't really like a rich area anymore. So, I mean, it's kind of come around and now it is again. But the point here is that like a neighborhood might have this kind of weird legacy and history about it that all does ultimately stem from like class dynamics in a really interesting way. And obviously in the United States, we only have a few hundred histories of a few hundred years of history of this kind of thing. Right. But you go into other places of the world, you know, where, you know, you've had cities that have lasted for, you know, a millennia or whatever, and you can see, like, you know, that's part of like the written like open wound of history, right? And particularly like historical materialism is real. It's like built into the fucking walls. I
think in like London, that has been around for over a millennia, like when the Black Plague was hitting the city, nascent epidemiologists were trying to figure out, why is it killing poor people first? And it was like, because they're living in their own shit.
Yeah.
Like,
big surprise.
Yeah. They're living in their own shit.
Yeah.
And, the aristocracy are eating ortolan buntings and drinking fucking limoncello and making zabaglione.